Hi. We're going to read chapter 9 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. In the last chapter, they met with the beaver, and they learned about who Aslan was, and they also learned about more about the White Witch and what her magic powers are. And while they were having this conversation with Mr. Beaver, their brother Edmund ran off to the White Witch, and they're very nervous because they think that Edmund is going to share some really confidential information about where they are, where Aslan is, and all that stuff. So they are on their way to go meet Aslan, and hopefully Edmund won't spill the beans, I guess. Coffee. Okay, chapter 9. And now, of course, you want to know what happened to Edmund. He had eaten his share of dinner, but he hadn't really enjoyed it because he was thinking about the enchanted Turkish delights he had had days previous with the White Witch. And there was nothing that spoils the taste of good ordinary food half so much as the memory of bad magic food. And he had heard the conversation and hadn't enjoyed it much either, because he kept thinking about that the others were taking no notice of him and trying to give him the cold shoulder. They weren't, but he imagined it. And then he had listened until Mr. Beaver told them about Aslan, and until he heard about the whole arrangement for Aslan and the stone table. It was then that he began very quietly to edge himself under the curtain which hung over the door. For the mention of Aslan gave him a mysterious and horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. Just as Mr. Beaver had been repeating the rhyme about Adam's flesh and Adam's bone, Edmund had been very quietly turning the door handle, and just before Mr. Beaver had begun telling them about the White Witch, telling them that the White Witch wasn't really human at all, but just half djinn and half giantess, Edmund had gone outside into the snow and cautiously closed the door behind him. You mustn't think that even now Edmund was quite so bad that he actually wanted his brothers and sisters to be turned to stone. But he did want Turkish delights, and he did want to be prince, and to pay Peter out for calling him a beast. As for what the witch would do to the others, he didn't want her to be particularly nice to them, certainly not to put them on the same level as himself, but he managed to believe, or to pretend to believe, that she wouldn't do anything bad to them. Because, he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it isn't true. She was so jolly nice to me anyway, much nicer than they are, and I expect that she is the rightful queen, really. Anyway, I bet she's better than that awful Aslan, thought Edmund. At least that was the excuse he made up in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, for deep down inside him, he really knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. The first thing he realized when he got outside and found the snow falling all around him was that he left his coat behind in the beaver's house. And of course, there was no chance of going back and getting it now. The next thing he realized was that daylight was almost gone, for it had been nearly 3 o'clock when they sat down for dinner, and the winter days were short. He hadn't reckoned on this, but he had to make the best of it. So he turned up his collar and shuffled across the top of the dam, to the far side of the river. It was pretty bad when he reached the far side. It was growing darker every minute, and with that the snowflakes were swirling around him, and he could hardly see 3 feet ahead. And then there was no road, too. He kept slipping in the deep snowdrifts and skidding on frozen puddles and tripping over fallen trees and sliding down steep banks and barking his shins against rocks, till he was wet, cold, and bruised all over. The silence and the loneliness was really dreadful, In fact, I really think he might have given up his whole plan and gone back and owned up and made friends with the others if he hadn't happened to say one thing to himself. When I'm the king of Narnia, the first thing I shall do is make decent roads. And of course, that set him off thinking about being king and all of the other things that he would do, and this cheered him up a great deal. He had just settled in his mind what sort of place he would have and how many cars and all the private cinema and the principal railways that would run and the laws that he would make against beavers and dams, and was putting the finished touches to his scheme and was putting the finishing touches to his schemes for keeping Peter in his place when the weather changed. First, the snow stopped. Then a wind sprang up and it became freezing cold. Finally, the clouds rolled away and the moon came out. It was a full moon, and shining on all that snow, it made everything bright as day. Only the shadows were rather confusing. He would never have found his way if the moon hadn't come out by the time that he had got to the other river. You remember he had seen a smaller river flowing between flowing into the great one lower down. He now reached this and turned up to follow it, but the little valley down which it came was much steeper and rockier than the one that he had just left, much overgrown with bushes, so that he could not have managed it all alone in the dark. Even as it was, he got wet through, for he had to stoop under branches, and great loads of snow came sliding onto his back. And every time this happened, he thought more of how he hated Peter, just as if all this had been Peter's fault. But as he came to the part where it was more level and the valley opened up, and there on the other side of the river, quite close to him, in the middle of the plain between the two hills, he saw what must be the White Witch's house. And the moon was shining brighter than ever. The house was really just a small castle. It seemed to be all towers, little towers, with long point spires on them, like sharp needles. They looked like huge dunce caps, or sorcerer's caps, and they shone in the moonlight, and their long shadows looked strange in the snow. Edmund began to be afraid of the house. But it was too late to be turning back now. He crossed the river on the ice and walked up to the house, and there was nothing stirring. Not the slightest sound anywhere. Even his own feet made no noise on the deep, newly fallen snow. He walked on, past corner after corner of the house, and past turret after turret to find the door. He had to go right to the far side before he found it. It was a huge arch with a great iron gates. But great iron gates stood wide open. Edmund crept up the arch and looked inside the courtyard, and there he saw a sight that nearly made his heart stop beating. Just inside the gate, with the moonlight shining on it, stood an enormous lion, crouched as if he was ready to spring. And Edmund stood in the shadow of the arch, afraid to go on and afraid to go back, with his knees knocking together. He stood there so long that his teeth would have been chattering with cold, even if they had not been chattering with fear. How long this really lasted, I'm not quite sure, but it seemed to Edmund to last for hours. Then, at last, he began to wonder why the lion was standing so still, for it hadn't moved 1 inch since he first set eyes on it. Edmund now ventured a little nearer, still keeping in the shadow of the arch as much as he could. And he now saw from the way the lion was standing that it couldn't have been looking at him at all. In fact, it was staring at something else, namely a little dwarf who stood with his back to it, only 4 feet away. Aha, thought Edmund. When it springs at the little dwarf, then will be my chance to escape. But still the lion never moved, nor did the dwarf. And now at last Edmund remembered what the others had said about the White Witch turning people into stone. Perhaps this was the only stone lion. And as soon as he thought of that, he noticed that the lion's back and the top of its head were covered in snow. Of course, it must only be a statue. No living animal would have let itself get covered with snow. Then very slowly, with his heart beating as if it would burst, Edmund ventured to go up to the lion. Even now he hardly dared to touch it, but at last he put his hand on it. And it was cold stone. He had been frightened of a mere statue. The relief which Edmund felt was so great that in spite of the cold he suddenly got warm all over down to his toes, and at the same time there came into his head what seemed to be a perfectly lovely idea. Probably, he thought, this is the great lion Aslan that they were all talking about. She's caught him already and turned him into stone. So that's the end of it. The end of all their fine ideas about him. Pooh, who's afraid of Aslan? He thought. And he stood there gloating over the stone lion, and presently he did something very silly and childish. He took a stump of lead pencil out of his pocket and scribbled a mustache on the lion's upper lip, and then a pair of spectacles on his eyes. Yeah, silly old Aslan, how do you like being stone? You thought yourself pretty fine, didn't ya? But despite the scribbles on his face, and the great stone beast still looked so terrible, and sad, and noble, staring at the moonlight, that Edmund didn't really get any fun out of jeering at it. He turned away and began to cross the courtyard. As he got to the middle, he saw that there were dozens of statues all about, standing here and there as the pieces stand on a chessboard when it is halfway through the game. There were stone stairs and stone wolves, stone bears, foxes, a mountain lion, everything. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women, but who were really the spirits of trees. There was a great shape of a centaur and a winged horse, and a little creature that Edmund took to be a dragon. They all looked strange standing there, perfectly lifelike and so perfectly still. In the bright, cold moonlight, that it was an eerie work crossing the courtyard. Right in the very middle stood the huge shape that was like a man, but it was tall as a tree and with a fierce face and shaggy beard and a great club in his right hand. Even though he knew that it was a stone giant and not a live one, Edmund did not like going past it. He now saw that there was a dim light showing from the doorway on the far side of the courtyard, and he went to it. There was a flight of stone steps going up to the open door, and Edmund went up them. Across the threshold lay a great wolf. That's all right, it's all right, he kept saying. It's only a stone wolf, and it cannot hurt me. He raised his legs and stepped over it. Instantly, the huge creature rose, with all of its hair bristling on its back, opened its great red mouth, and in a growling voice said, "Who's there? Who's there? Stand still, stranger, and tell me who you are." "Oh, if you please, sir," said Edmund, trembling. "My name is Edmund. I am the son of Adam that Her Majesty met in the woods the other day, and I have come to bring her news of my brother and sister. They are now in Narnia, quite close. They're in the beaver's house, actually. She wanted to see them." "I will tell Her Majesty," said the wolf. "Meanwhile, stand still on the threshold, as you value your life." And then the wolf vanished into the house. Edmund stood and waited, his fingers aching with cold and his heart pounding in his chest. And presently the grey wolf, Magrim, the chief of the witches' secret police, came bounding back and said, come in, fortune favorite of the queen, or else not so fortunate," the great wolf said to Edmund. And Edmund went in, taking great care not to tread on the wolf's paw. He found himself in a long, gloomy hallway with many pillars, full as the courtyard had been of statues. On the nearest The one nearest the door was a little fawn, with a very sad expression on his face, and Edmund couldn't help but wondering if it might be Lucy's friend. The only light came through from a single lamp-post, and close beside this sat the White Witch. "I have come, your Majesty," said Edmund, rushing forward eagerly. "How dare you come alone?" said the witch in a terrible voice. "Did I not tell you to bring the others with you?" she added. "Oh, please, your Majesty," said Edmund. "I've done the best that I can. I brought them quite close. They're in the little house on top of the dam just up the river, with Mr. Beaver and Mrs. Beaver." A very slow, cruel smile came over the witch's face. "Is that all your news?" she asked him. "No, your Majesty," said Edmund. And he proceeded to tell her all that he had heard before leaving the Beaver's house. "What?" the queen cried. "Aslan? Aslan, is this true? If I find that you have lied to me," and she pointed her finger at Edmund. "Please, I'm only repeating what they said," Edmund stammered. But the queen, who was no longer attending to him, clapped her hands. Instantly, the same dwarf who Edmund had seen her with before appeared, and she ordered him, "Make ready our sleigh, and use the harness without the bells." Okay. That was the end of chapter 9. I think we can do chapter 10. I just need a drink of water because my throat's dry. It's coffee, but... Okay. Here we go. Chapter 10. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 children as soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There is no time to lose." So they went from narrating all the children together to then narrating just Edmund and the White Witch, and now they're going back to narrating Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the other 3 siblings. Okay. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves in coats except Mrs. Beaver, who was starting to pack up snacks and laying them on the table. "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that ham, and there's a packet of tea, and there's sugar and some matches, and if someone will get 2 or 3 loaves of the crook over there in the corner." "What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" explained Susan. "I'm packing a load for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You think we'd set out on a journey with nothing to eat, didn't you?" "But we don't have time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. She may be here any minute." "That's what I say," chimed Mr. Beaver. "Get along with you all," said his wife. "Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for a quarter of an hour at least." "But don't we want to get as big of a head start as we can possibly get?" said Peter. If we're to reach the stone table before her?" "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. "As soon as she has looked in here and finds that we're all gone, she'll be off at top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver, "but we can't get there before her, whatever we do, for she'll be on sleigh and we'll be walking." "Well then, there's no hope," said Susan. Now don't you get fussing, said Mrs. Beaver, but just about half a dozen of clean handkerchiefs out of the drawer. "Course we've got hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways that she won't expect, and perhaps we'll get through." "Well, that's true enough, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband. But it's time we were out of this." "And don't you start fussing with me either, Mrs. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. That's 5 loads, and the smallest one is for the smallest of us. That's you, my dear," she added, looking at Lucy. "Oh, do please come on," said Lucy. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," said Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine is too heavy to bring," she added. "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver. "It's a great deal too heavy. And I don't think you'll be able to use it while we're on the run." "I can't abide the thought of having the witch fiddling with it," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it. It's as likely as not." "Oh, please, please, do hurry," said the 3 children. The snow had stopped and the moon had come out when they began their journey. They went in a single file, first Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, and then Mrs. Beaver last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and onto the riverbank, and then they went along a very rough sort of path along the trees and down by the riverbank. The sides of the valley were shining in the moonlight, towered up far above them on either hand. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. She'll have to keep on top, for she can't bring a sleigh down here." It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at through the window of a comfortable armchair. And even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on walking and walking and walking, and the sack that she was carrying felt heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep it all. And she stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river and the waterfalls of ice, and at the white masses of the treetops and the great glaring moon and the countless stars, and could only watch the short little legs of Mr. Beaver going pad, 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 pad through the snow in front of her, as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared, and the snow began to fall once more, and at last Lucy was so tired that she almost fell asleep while walking. Then she suddenly found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the riverbank to go right and was leading them steeply uphill to the thickest of bushes. And then she came fully awake, and she found that Mr. Beaver was just vanishing into a hole in the bank, which had been almost hidden under the bushes, until you realized you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing. So they're going into like a little tunnel? I don't know. Lucy immediately stooped down, and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her. In a moment, all 5 of them were inside the cave. "Where is this?" Peter's voice said, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. "It's the old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver. "And a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we've got a few hours to sleep." "If you hadn't all been in such a plaguey fuss when we were starting, I'd have brought some pillows," said Mrs. Beaver. It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnan's, Lucy thought. Just a hole in the ground, but it was dry and earthy. It was very small, so that when they lay down, they were all a bundle of clothes together. And what with that, and being warmed up by their long walk, they were already rather snug. If only the floor of the cave had been a little smoother. Then Mr. Beaver handed round in the dark a little flask of which everyone drank something, and it made them cough and sputter a little, and stung in their throat. But it also made them feel delicious and warm when they swallowed it. And everyone went straight to sleep. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, when she woke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff, and thinking how she would like a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek, and saw the cold daylight coming in through the mouth of the cave. Immediately after that, she was very wide awake indeed. And so was everyone else. In fact, they were sitting up with their mouths and eyes wide open, listening to the sound, which was the very sound that they had been thinking of during their walk last night. It was the sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Excuse me. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do, but it was a very sensible thing to do. He knew he could scramble to the top of the bank among the bushes and the branches without being seen. And he wanted above all to see which way the witch's sleigh went. The others all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 minutes, and then they heard something frightening that frightened them very much. They heard voices. Oh, Lucy thought, he's been seen. She caught him. Great with their surprise, when a little later, they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling them from just outside the cave. It's all right, he shouted. Come on, Mrs. Beaver, come out, sons of Daughter and Eve. It's all right, it isn't her. This was bad grammar, of course, but this is how beavers talk when they are excited. I mean, in Narnia, in our world, they usually don't talk at all. So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave and blinking in the daylight, and with earth all over them, and looking very unbrushed, uncombed, and with sleep in their eyes. Come on, cried Mr. Beaver, come on, see. This is the nasty knock for the witch. It looks like as if her powers are already crumbling. What do you mean, Mr. Beaver? Panted Peter as he scrambled up the steep bank to the valley. Didn't I tell you, answered Mr. Beaver, that she made it winter. She made it always winter and never Christmas. Didn't I tell you? Well, just come and see, he said. And then they were all on top, and they did see. It was a sleigh, and it was reindeer with bells and a harness. But they were far bigger than the witch's reindeer, and they were not white but brown. And on the sleigh sat a person whom everyone knew the moment they set their eyes on him. He was a huge man in a bright red robe, with a hood that had fur inside it and a great white beard that fell like foamy waterfall over his chest. Everyone knew him because, though you see people of his sort only in Narnia, everyone knew him because, though you see people of his sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of him and hear them talk about even in our world. The world on the side of the wardrobe. The world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you really see them in Narnia, it's rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look funny and jolly. But now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find him quite like that. He was so big and so glad and so real that they all became quite still. They felt very glad, but also very solemn. I've come at last, he said. She has kept me for a long time, but I've got out at last. Aslan is on the move. The witch's magic is weakening. And Lucy felt running through her a deep shiver of gladness, which you only get if you are being solemn and still. And now, said Father Christmas, for your presents. Here are new and better sewing machine for you, Mrs. Beaver. I will drop it off at your house as I pass. Oh, if you please, sir, said Mrs. Beaver, making a curtsy. It's locked up. Locks and bolts make no difference to me, said Father Christmas. And as for you, Mr. Beaver, when you get home you will find a dam finished and mended and all the leaks stopped. Mr. Beaver was so pleased that he opened his mouth very wide and found that he couldn't say anything at all. Peter, Adam's son, said Father Christmas. Here, sir, said Peter. There are your presents, was the answer. And they are tools, not toys. The time you use them is perhaps near at hand. Bear them well. With these words, he handed Peter a shield and a sword. The shield was the color of silver, and across it there ramped a red lion, as bright as ripe strawberry. At that moment when you pick it up, the hilt of the sword was gold, and it had a sheath and the sword belt and everything it needed. And it was just the right size and right weight for Peter to use. Peter was silent and solemn as he received these gifts, for he felt they were that they were a very serious kind of present. "Susan, daughter of Eve," said Father Christmas, "these are for you." He handed her a quiver full of bows and a bow and a little ivory horn. "You must use the bow only in great need," he said, "for I do not mean for you to fight in battle. For I do not mean for you to fight in the battle. It does not easily miss. And when you put this horn to your lips and blow it, then, whenever you are, I think help of some kind will come to you. Last of all, Lucy, daughter of Eve, come forward." He gave her a little bottle that looked like glass, and a small dagger. "In this bottle," he said, "there is a cordial made of the juice of one of the fire flowers that grows in the mountains of the sun. And if you or your friends are hurt, a few drops of this will restore them. And the dagger is to defend yourself at great need, for you are not to be in the battle." "Why, sir?" said Lucy. I think that I could be brave enough," said Lucy. "That's not the point," he said. "But battles are ugly when women fight." Okay. "But battles are ugly when women fight. And now," he said suddenly, looking less grave, "here's something for the moment for all of you." He brought out a big bag, and a large tray containing 5 cups and saucers, a bowl, a lump of sugar, a jug of cream, and a great big teapot sizzling with piping hot. And then he cried out, "Merry Christmas! Long live the true King!" Then he cracked his whip, and he and the reindeer and the sleigh all went out of sight before anyone realized that they had started. Peter had just drawn his sword out of the sheath and was showing it to Mr. Beaver when the Beaver said, now then, don't stand talking till the tea gets cold. Come help carry the tray down the hill and we'll have some breakfast. What a mercy I thought of bringing the bread knife." So down the steep bank they went to the cave, and Mr. Beaver cut out some bread for ham sandwiches, and Mrs. Beaver poured the tea, and everyone enjoyed themselves. But long before they had finished enjoying themselves, the Beaver said, "It's time to be moving now." I don't remember that part of the book at all. I did not know that Santa... Oh, that's the end of the chapter. I didn't know Santa showed up. It's kind of weird. Okay, so they are on the run. The 3 siblings and the 2 beavers are on the run, trying to reach Aslan before the queen gets there. They walked all night, or most of the night, and then they found a cave to hide in. And then they ran into Santa, and they got a whole bunch of, like, enchanted gifts that will help them in the battle. And I guess in this book, women aren't allowed to go into battle, which is kind of lame. Okay. Yeah, we'll read chapter 11 another day.